Peter Thiel's important for a lot of reasons. I guess, start off with Peter Thiel by noting that he co-founded PayPal. And so PayPal is sort of one of these ubiquitous, financial sort of like fintech websites, one of the pioneers of the field, rather. And, from its earliest days, people that were involved in setting up PayPal, which includes people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, it's been said by the people who were making that company alongside them that they were in discussions with intelligence agencies and federal agencies from the very beginning about what, those entities were, what they would support in a fintech company, essentially. And, as I reported back when I wrote for Mint Press, the involvement of the now PayPal owner of the who created the Intercept and sort of privatized these Snowden leaks, and a lot of them ended up, never coming out. Allegedly, some of the ones that never came out documented in detail PayPal's relationship to intelligence that has supposedly been ongoing for some time. But aside from PayPal, the clear indicator of intelligence ties with Peter Thiel comes in the form of Palantir, which he incorporated in 2003, but which didn't really start as a company around 2004, 2005. Its first funder was the CIA's venture capital arm, In-Q-Tel. The CIA was its only client until 2008. And between 2005 and 2009, the top engineers at Palantir say they made over 200 visits to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, where the CIA directly guided and tweaked, their software products, which are now used by intelligence agencies around the world, as well as healthcare agencies. The HHS and CDC in the US use Palantir, so does the UK's NHS, and it's expanded really throughout the world. What is really arguably a CIA front company, as I've written in past reports on Palantir, the reason, or rather that what Alex Karp and Peter Thiel were interested in doing when they created Palantir was essentially privatizing the Total Information Awareness Program that had just been defunded by Congress. Total information awareness is sort of an outgrowth of the Reagan-Bush era of domestic surveillance, schemes, some of which came up during the Iran-Contra proceedings and are linked to things like the continuity of government protocols and the main core database, which are efforts to sort of label people, label domestic dissidents as subversives, based on their online activity. And of course, in the 80s, it was based on other metrics, but now it's your online activity. So whatever data the NSA, for example, hoovers up about you, Palantir decides whether you're deemed subversive or not. And given the continuity of government protocols, which are still on the books, if the US government decides to invoke those, which can be under very vague circumstances, these people labeled subversives by Palantirs could have their constitutional rights suspended if those protocols are ever invoked. So Palantir's role in that, as far as the national security state goes, very nefarious, and they've been very involved in a lot of, other aspects of governance. It's gotten, increasingly bloated and large with over the years. It was intimately involved in Ukrainian military operations during the Ukraine-Russian conflict that's, of course, still ongoing, and are now playing an outsized role in Israel's war on Gaza, which is, as I'm sure Mint Press viewers know, is using AI to mass murder entire families. And Palantir is openly a big part of that, and they're very proud of that. And even when Peter Thiel was asked about that quite recently, he said his bias was to defer to Israel as it relates to the use of AI, this AI-powered war machine that's, committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. And there's a lot of other things to say about Palantir, too. I mean, this company really has a nefarious history. One of the things that a lot of people forget about them is that they created the first plan pitched to the federal government to destroy WikiLeaks and sort of what they called the WikiLeaks threat and stop, national security leak-based reporting. Talked about targeting people like Julian Assange and Glenn Greenwald specifically. So, this is a company that doesn't value freedom of speech or freedom or your privacy or really, any constitutional right you have, and they directly enable, the warrantless spying on all Americans and use that to profile you on behalf of the national security state. And what's unfortunate, too, is that, we know how Peter Thiel's influence during Trump's first campaign translated into Palantir getting what the New York Times called a bonanza of contracts with the military, the U.S. military, and also with, even more so with U.S. intelligence. And now we also have, the other PayPal co-founder, Elon Musk, now deepening his ties with intelligence agencies through SpaceX, and which was, of course, already technically an intelligence contractor because Space Force is both part of the military and also an intelligence agency. And so really what you're seeing here is this particular faction of oligarchs, sometimes referred to as the so-called PayPal mafia, which have their tendrils deeply embedded in both parties. You may have Peter Thiel and Republican, but you'll have Reid Hoffman and Pierre Omidyar on the Democrat side, for example, and then Elon Musk also now on the Republican side. But really, these are people that build de facto monopolies in direct connection with the U.S. national security state. And if you look at Palantir, it's very clear they care very little about our constitutional rights and freedoms. And despite perhaps, the rhetoric they may espouse publicly. And, it's very unfortunate that so many people believe how they frame themselves rhetorically, because it goes very against their actions. For example, Peter Thiel is often referred to by others as a libertarian, but this is someone who says that he doesn't like free market competition because competition can negatively impact profits, and openly promotes the idea of, quartering a market and building a monopoly. And when he's done that, which he has, he's done it in direct collaboration from the very beginning with the U.S. national security state. So I would not call that libertarian. I think it's quite clearly fascist. J.D. Vance really owes both his political career and his previous venture capital career to Peter Thiel. For example, Peter Thiel first met J.D. Vance when J.D. Vance was in law school, and subsequently offered him his first job in venture capital at a Thiel created venture capital firm called Mithril Capital. After that, Vance went on to become involved with AOL co-founder Steve Case and in Revolution Ventures, and managed a fund there called Rise of the Rest, I believe, which was heavily funded by the Walton family behind Walmart, Jeff Bezos, and, a lot of prominent figures of the American oligarchy, and subsequently started his own venture capital firm, Narya Capital, with heavy backing again from Peter Thiel and also from Eric Schmidt, who's a major actually donor to Biden and intimately involved in Biden's science and tech policy. And actually, the two of them are on the steering committee of the rather infamous Bilderberg Conference, interestingly enough. And in addition, when Vance decided to run for office, or, for Senate, he was heavily funded by Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel donated $15 million to his campaign, which I believe at the time, and maybe still is, the largest donation, a single donation ever made to a Senate candidate. And then J.D. Vance ran initially sort of as a never Trumper and was very anti-Trump. And he became his vice presidential pick, arguably because that rocky relationship was soothed over by Peter Thiel personally, who took and accompanied J.D. Vance to Trump's Mar-a-Lago to sort of smooth over that relationship. And then Vance sort of became a big Trump proponent. And arguably there's a lot of people have referred to Vance as a Peter Thiel protege. And I think, given the evidence, that's pretty fair. But Peter Thiel has several proteges. Vance is one in politics now, and obviously prominent in the Republican Party. But other, noteworthy proteges include people like Sam Altman of OpenAI and WorldCoin, and also Palmer Luckey of the defense startup Anduril, and also of Oculus Rift, the virtual reality system that was sold to Facebook, which Peter Thiel, was on the board of from like 2005 until 2022, when he left to try and get Trump-aligned candidates. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about the move into central bank digital currencies, for example, or CBDCs. And there's been a lot of criticism around those because of the idea of it being programmable, surveillable money. But for money to be programmable and surveillable, it doesn't necessarily have to be issued by a central bank. It can be also issued by the private sector. And you can add that same type of Orwellian surveillance and, the concerns about programmability, deciding what you can or can't buy based on various metrics, or, based on your online activity, or, the claims of a coming social credit system and all of that. You can have that issued by the private sector, no problem. And so there's been efforts to make a digital dollar in the United States. And there's been concern that there would be a CBDC in the United States. And that's certainly been happening in other countries. But I think in the United States, it's increasingly unlikely, especially considering that, the Federal Reserve in the United States is essentially owned by the private Wall Street banks. And if you're, a central bank digital currency, then the central bank is doing a lot of the job that Wall Street banks normally do. And Wall Street banks want to keep the two-tier system of private banking and central banking as it exists today. So they're most likely to be the issuers of that currency. And I think PayPal, in some of my recent reporting on my website, Unlimited Hangout, have focused a lot on how there's efforts by these groups that are either ex-PayPal or who currently own PayPal to have PayPal and a lot of the companies that are intimately connected to it, for example, like Latin America's Mercado Libre, to be the rails on which all of these digital currencies will run, and to essentially dominate the field. And it's very likely that PayPal's PYUSD is going to be a major contender in that. A lot of, other dollar stablecoins may be as well, like Tether, which was intimately tied up with the FTX scandal, or Circle, which has a very intimate relationship with Larry Fink's BlackRock. Any of these, but essentially which digital dollar coins are going to win, that's not going to be all be determined by regulation legislation that's being written. It has to be approved first, right, by the Senate Banking Committee on which JD Vance sits. And so, having these particular Silicon Valley figures all tied to PayPal influence him, I think in that context is somewhat, significant, because regulation determines the winners and the losers in the market that it's regulating, right? And so, if the people writing the bill all have ties to the same companies that want to be winners, they can be favored, at the legislative level and, have their, work cut out for them essentially and come to dominate the market. And, PayPal has expressed for a long time they want to dominate the market. You have Peter Thiel on record saying that PayPal was created to replace the US dollar. So there's a lot of things happening here. And what you'd have, as a consequence of that would be the people that run PayPal who, in recent years have just been censoring people for things they've written and stuff like that. They're the ones that would be capable of programming and surveilling your money. And, that's very unfortunate, especially when you consider the connections of, someone like Pierre Omidyar, who owns PayPal right now, which I wrote about Press, several years ago. And I know that Max Blumenthal also did an investigative series for MetPress on our Pierre Omidyar. That's very important. I would encourage people to look at those to learn more about the people that are essentially running this company. And also, the other people that make up this particular network that is very connected to the so-called PayPal mafia and really the PayPal co-founders. I mean, the intelligence ties abound. And I think it's a lot of them frame themselves as, pro-constitution, pro-freedom and all of this. But, a lot of their business decisions reflect something else entirely. And I think it's, important to warn people about this. Well, I think it's quite clear if you look at, just American politicians in general over the last 100 years plus, they tend to serve their biggest donors. Correct. And are influenced by their donors. And that's why, follow the money has always been so important when you're reporting on political realities or political figures in the United States. And I think it's abundantly clear that JD Vance has those kind of very deep connections to Peter Thiel, and his political career and his venture capitalist career would not have existed if it were not for him. And it's also important to point out that after the vice presidential announcement, you have close allies of Peter Thiel, whether it's Elon Musk or David Sachs or Palmer Luckey or Palantir itself, a Palantir co-founder alongside Thiel named Joe Lonsdale, all beginning to dump millions of dollars per month in the same super PAC that's supporting the Trump-Vance ticket, only after that VP announcement was made. So clearly it seems like that particular network is quite convinced that Vance is going to be their guy when in office. And it's worth pointing out that a lot of these guys are very interested in dominating the digital financial system to come. For example, Elon Musk says that he plans to turn X, Twitter, into half of the financial system. And JD Vance has been on the Senate Banking Committee. He's involved in crypto regulation legislation that's being written and drafted and going to be put before Congress. And it's very likely that he'll be involved in choosing the kingmakers of that, like, PayPal's very own recently launched stablecoin and any of these others, companies and currencies that they're, intimately connected to.
If you enjoyed today's video on Anonymous Official, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks for watching and sticking with us.